Chapter 2, Studying Marriages and the Family. Chapter 2 is divided into two parts. The first is on theory, and then the second is on research methods. And what I have done is I have built some questions and answers in behind part 1 where we talk about theories, and then again behind part 2 where we discuss research methods. One of the things that if you've had me for another class, you've probably heard me say, is that the internet is dangerous. While it has a great deal of useful information, it also has a great deal of bad information out there. And one of the things that your author points out in this chapter is the fact that access to bad information, to not knowing fact about something, is dangerous. And frankly, sometimes it could be lethal. And so one of the things that your text author presents is this information about consulting an online source for medical information. And your author points out there's been a lot of research on this that finds that information provided by these sites can either be dead wrong, can be incongruent with other information found online, can leave out important information. And all of this is very dangerous. I remember I tried to find the site and I couldn't. I remember reading some information a few years ago about teenagers going to online sites for information about sex. And I do remember reading one of the findings was that teenagers did not define sex as they should have. They define sex very simply as intercourse, sexual intercourse. That's how they define sex. Well, what's the problem with that? If there are other things that can be done that are still sexual, and therefore you can still get STDs from. And but these teenage girls would be misled by thinking that the only thing sexual would be intercourse, and they would feel safe to do other things. When in fact it was very, very dangerous. And of course, teenage pregnancy falls into this area as well. There's a lot of inconsistent, incongruent information on the internet. It can be very, very dangerous. All right, let's start talking about theory. Theory is what guides research, and research ultimately is what we're aiming at talking about here, with the idea that you can understand how we get information, how we get data about the many things that we're going to be studying in this course. And the idea here is that research is theory-driven. So let's start discussing theory. First of all, theory is nothing to be scared of. A lot of people hear the word theory and they want to run. But theory is pretty simple. What does theory do? It explains things. And as I state here, it's a statement of how and why facts are related. And a theory attempts to explain why, how, or when things happen. So this is another thing we can attach to theory, is that it works on the idea of understanding something, testing it, and understanding it well enough to allow for predictions, which ultimately is the goal of science in general, is to be able to predict things. Now, theories also contain parts. They contain concepts, propositions, and are preceded by axioms. Axioms. We need to discuss that real briefly. Axioms are assumptions, taken for granted truths that must pre-exist science, rather the scientific method, and must also pre-exist theories. Okay? In other words, they're the accepted truths that have to exist for what comes next, whether it's science in general or whether it's specific theories. These are the three axioms of general science. In other words, every science has at least these three axioms. Axiom 1. This is a realist's world. A world of things in themselves objectively out there, whether we can perceive them or not. So for instance, how do I know that there's something out there called air or oxygen? Because I can't see either one of them, but I know they're there. How would I know this? Well, for instance, you're listening to this. I'm speaking. The idea is that wouldn't happen if we didn't have oxygen or air. So I know air and oxygen are real. I know they're there, even though I can't see it. Axiom 2. We can perceive this world. In other words, with our senses. We can feel it. We can taste it. We can smell it. Whatever the case may be. We can perceive this world. And then finally, Axiom 3. The world is ordered. This is not to be taken for granted. This is actually, it's a very, very important axiom. Imagine if there was no order, then we would live in a very chaotic place. And if everything was chaotic, everything was random, obviously with no order, what couldn't we do? And the answer is we couldn't predict. So axiom 3, that the world is ordered, is a very, very important axiom. So again, all three of these axioms are for general science. Now, for particular sciences, for particular theories, there will almost certainly be additional axioms. For instance, let's talk about home and social exchange theory. All right, let's talk about home and social exchange theory. I will identify the axiom that it will additionally use in addition to those three axioms of general science. But let me explain what home and social exchange theory is first. It's a micro-level theory, which means it has very limited applicability. It can only be used to study really social interaction, and that's about it. And it's based upon an economic model of exchange. Reward minus cost equals profit. This is the classic example that I use in my classes. Let's say, for instance, you were going to have a party and you wanted to buy tomatoes. So you go down to the farmer's market and you go from stall to stall, vendor to vendor, looking at tomatoes. And you're asking how much, and you're looking at the tomatoes as you go from vendor to vendor. And you come to one where you look at the tomatoes, and they're great-looking tomatoes. They look like they're ripe and everything. And you ask how much, and the vendor tells you, and it's an acceptable price. So you literally, imagine this, literally, you're reaching out your hand with cash, and he's reaching out his hand with the tomatoes. So that is an economic exchange, money for tomatoes. So you go home and you clean the tomatoes up and you slice them and everything else, and you serve them to your guests that night at the party. And your guests come up to you and say, "Boy, those were fantastic tomatoes. I mean, they were so ripe. Where did you get those?" Now, that night, as you're falling asleep, and you may not be aware of this, actually you probably wouldn't be, as you're falling asleep, your brain is doing a calculation, which is reward minus cost equals profit. What was your reward? The tomatoes were ripe, your guests complimented you. What was your cost? Money. But it was a reasonable amount of money. Did you profit? Yes, you did. So, what an economic model of exchange would suggest that the next time you needed tomatoes, you would go right back to that same vendor, because if you profited before, you're going to make the assumption you will profit again. Okay. So that's the economic model. Now, George Hohmann said, you know what, if we do that in economic exchanges, we also do that in our face-to-face, our human interaction exchanges, our interactions with people. So, for instance, he would suggest that what if you're getting ready to leave for class one morning, and you're just getting ready to walk out the door, and the telephone rings. And on the phone is a friend of yours, and he says, "Hey man, my car won't start. You mind giving me a ride to school?" And since he's a friend, you say yes. So you drive over to his house, and he's standing outside waiting for you. So as soon as you pull up, he gets in the car, and the first thing he says is, "Hey man, I really want to tell you how much I appreciate this. Let me buy you a beer, or let me buy you the gas, or something like this to pay you back." And you drive to school, and you talk, and you have a good time. And you get to school, he gets out, and he says, "Thanks again. I'm not going to forget this. I'm going to buy you a beer tomorrow night," or whatever it is. Okay. Throughout the day, even though you're probably not conscious of it, you're thinking about that. And what you've decided is that you profited from that exchange. As it turns out, you weren't late for class. Your friendship with him may have been strengthened. He offered to buy you a beer or buy gas, something like this. And what was your cost? Well, he really didn't live too far out of the way, so your cost was minimal. Okay, so you've decided that you would profit, which means this. The next morning, If you're getting ready to leave for class and the phone rings and you look at your caller ID and it's the same friend of yours, you're probably going to answer the phone. In that, you profited the day before. You would make the assumption you would profit again today if you answered the phone. In other words, we tend to repeat social interactions where we perceive to have profited. It's not a very difficult theory to understand, but the point is this. If you look at what it says, reward minus cost equals profit. Imagine taking your hands and putting them out to the side of you, pretending like your hands are a scale, weighted with different amounts on both sides as the scale goes up and down. So imagine, one side of that scale being reward and the other side of that scale being cost. What Hohmann's social exchange theory suggests is that we are very rational. And to go further, we're not going to do anything unless there's something in it for us. In other words, unless we think we're going to profit from an exchange, Hohmann suggests that we're not going to perform that exchange. So it's a very, very rational view of mankind. That being the case, think back to the axioms of general science. And now we're going to add, for this theory, for instance, for Hohmann's social exchange theory, we would add an additional axiom, which in this case is man is rational. And the theory would depend on the fact that that axiom exists. Because if man wasn't rational, then reward minus cost equals profit would make absolutely no sense and certainly not be a predictable outcome. So Hohmann's social exchange theory would depend on that, at least that, additional axiom. All right, this is where we're going to start looking at individual theories as they are used to study the family. This is the ecological model of development put forward by Bronfenbrenner. I remember studying him when I was working on my PhD. And here are the systems that we've been talking about. There you see the microsystem in the center, which is basically the family, the child and his or her parents. And then we've got the mesosystem, right? In other words, where the child has probably daily interaction with, such as, essentially the educational system, daycare, school, also friends, maybe the extended family, religious groups, maybe healthcare providers, depending upon the health of the child and so forth. So there's direct interaction there. And then we move on out to the exosystem. This is basically from without. In other words, the child does not have direct interaction with members of the exosystem. They affect, the child's development and so forth, but not directly. They are indirectly for the most part. And then we have the macrosystem. Now, these are definitely, extraneous to the child. In other words, technological changes, economic recessions such as the one that we're in, wars, cultural values and beliefs. All of these things exist. They have a phenomenal effect on us, but we don't interact with the entire component. We don't interact with the war per se, or with technological things per se. Even if we were in the process of helping invent these things, we're still affected by these things without really affecting them. And so that we are members of all these things at one time, and they affect our development and growth. Structural functionalism is one of the more dominant theories in sociology, and it is probably also one of the more dominant theories used to study the family. So let's look at its characteristics. We're going to be looking at systems theory in the next couple of slides to help me explain structural functionalism. But at this point, I want you to understand that when we're talking about a system, we're talking about parts that are what are called interdependent. I'll make this clear in the next couple of slides. But the idea is that every system, regardless of what we want to study and identify as a system, is made up of parts. And if that system wants to survive, those parts must be what are called interdependent. In other words, they must work together to accomplish whatever goal exists. So, if we're talking about the family, we can look at generally two types of tasks that are provided by members of a particular family or system. First are what are called instrumental tasks. And instrumental tasks are basically physical effort, logic, thought, reason, these kinds of things. And then expressive tasks are generally emotional tasks. Now already you can kind of get an idea as to who more likely provides each of those two tasks. It may be stereotypical, but generally in our culture, because we do not have male and female equality here. Generally speaking, instrumental tasks are more likely to be provided by males, and expressive tasks more likely to be provided by females. Now, if we look at family functions, there are two terms I want you to understand that are always going to be associated with structural functionalism. First, manifest functions. Manifest functions are intended functions. In other words, there is a reason for the function. The function exists because people, members of the system, realized that they needed to do something in the way of some behavior to help the system survive. So for instance, a manifest function, since it is an intended function, if we look at the Native American rain dance, which is the classic example of functions, well, why do Native American cultures practice the rain dance? The answer is to make it rain. In other words, there is a manifest need, there is an intended need to have rain. In other words, you have to have rain. You're going to grow crops, you're going to survive, you have to have rain. So the manifest intended function of the rain dance is to make it rain. On the other hand, when we study the Native American rain dance, when we study Native American culture, what we find is there is what's called an accidental or latent function of the rain dance. For instance, the chief latent function of the Native American rain dance is that it makes the members of the culture more cohesive. In other words, it's bringing them together. For it's more than a dance. I mean, this is religious overtones and so forth. This is the identity of the Native American culture is that dance. So it's bringing the members of that culture together, and it's solidifying, it's creating bonds between them and making them more cohesive. So that's not the reason that they're getting together, but it's a latent function in that it's a very positive, albeit unintended, function. Okay? We could look at other kinds of systems as well, and we will in the next couple of slides. But remember that manifest functions are intended functions. Latent functions are accidental functions. Okay? And finally, systems, which represent structural functionalism, are greatly affected by the environment. I'm going to show you this in just one second. The next slide will actually show what I'm talking about, but let me go through this real quickly. As I said, systems are made up of parts, and those parts must be interdependent. They must work together to accomplish some goal. Every system has a goal, and it's pretty basic. The primary goal of any system is survival. There may be other goals following that, but the primary goal is for survival. A system exists within an environment. Okay? So the system has boundaries, exists within the environment, and has boundaries that separate it from the environment. The environment provides some kind of raw resource to the system. I'm going to explain this to you in the next slide. And then the system works its magic, produces whatever it's going to produce, whether it's a socialized child or an educated student. The system basically spits back out a finished product into the environment. Okay? Now, unfortunately, the environments change from time to time. Things change in the environments, and systems must respond if they want to survive. We've talked about this idea that systems have identifiable boundaries so that you can know who's in the system and who's not. Now, let's actually look at an example of a system while I discuss it. Okay, here's where I want to use, for instance, CSU as the system that we want to study. So notice in the circle, that's our system. That circle represents our system. And in that system are the three dominant parts of CSU: faculty, students, and staff. Okay? Now, if you remember, those parts of the system must be interdependent. In other words, they must work together to accomplish the system's goals. If they can't work together, so that they're independent of each other, then the system dies. It's as simple as that. So a system must have parts, and those parts must be interdependent on each other. Okay. Imagine around the circle, at the edge of the circle, there's what's called a boundary. Okay? In other words, a boundary that separates the members of the system from the environment. Okay? Now, boundaries are visible. If we're talking about CSU as a system, the boundary can be made visible if you ask somebody for an ID card. Students, faculty, and staff all have ID cards that show us as members of the CSU system. And if you don't have an ID card, you're not a member of the system. Likewise, parking stickers or hang tags, all faculty, staff, and students have some way of identifying that they are members of the system and therefore have a legal right to park on campus. There again, it's a way of knowing who's in the system and who's not. So that border separates members of the system from the environment. And as I said, environments give raw resources to the system. So for this case, if we're talking about CSU, can you imagine what raw resource the environment gives CSU? Obviously, the best answer here is students who do not yet have the bachelor's degree or master's, depending upon the program you want to study in. So in other words, how about uneducated students? So that's what the environment provides CSU, the system. And the system works its magic on that raw resource, those uneducated students, and 4, 5, 6 years later, spits out back to the environment graduated students who have earned their degrees. Okay? So the environment gives some kind of raw resource to the system. The system works its magic and spits back a finished product to the environment. Okay? Now, sometimes environments change. And if the system wants to survive, it must adapt to those changes. For instance, here probably 10, 15 years ago, I suppose, most universities around the country began to realize how much the student body was changing at their universities. For instance, I forget what the percentage is here at CSU, but it's pretty high. In other words, nationally, there are a lot of what are called non-traditional students going to school. Now, what's a non-traditional versus a traditional student? If you're 18 to 22, and in college or university, you are considered a traditional student. In other words, traditionally aged. If you are older than that, then you are what's called a non-traditional student. All right. So, within the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of non-traditional students going to colleges and universities throughout the United States. So that represents a change in the environment when you stop and think about it. In other words, there's greater demand now for non-traditional students, maybe even to the point of rivaling traditionally aged students for that demand. So, if that represents the change in the environment, can you think of some things that universities and colleges needed to do to respond to that change in the environment if they wanted to survive? For instance, what kinds of things have universities come up with to cater to non-traditional students? A lot of times non-traditional students who have full-time jobs, for instance. If you've come up with, for instance, distance learning, in other words, online courses, you'd be right. Some colleges and universities programs manage to have weekend programs. Many programs are able to offer degrees by night courses. Even CSU has come up with what are called multi-entry points. In other words, where normally you would start a class in August and that class would run through December. Now you can begin a class in August that runs through, I think, something like the 1st of October, and then you start a second class. So in other words, there are multi-entry points, twice per semester rather than once, which is catering towards non-traditional students who need to get done with the course as soon as possible. Okay, one final statement. I think I've already kind of introduced this to you. All systems have goals. They have goals. The primary goal is going to be about survival. But they all have goals, and they must adapt to changes in the environment. Now let's look at a more tangible example related to the family. Okay, so now we have the family as our system. And as we define in the United States, generally a nuclear family is for the most part how we define a family, which is mom and dad and their kids. And usually those definitions, if you remember, pretty well biological. In other words, they're biological kids. But fine, let's throw in foster kids or maybe even adopted kids. Mom, dad, and kids. Well, they work together. When you stop and think about this, you'll understand that they do work together. Now, in the early years of a child's life, then it is more a case that mom and dad work together to provide for the needs of the child. As the child gets a little older, maybe mom and dad not only provide for those needs, maybe mom and dad share discipline, the disciplining of the child. But as the child begins to age, the child begins to start participating, start doing things which actually affect mom and dad. In other words, the child starts doing things that are necessary in the system. And there may be little things. For instance, if mom goes back to work, what would be expected of children to help the family essentially survive? At some point, it might be that children of certainly by the age of 7 or 8, I would suspect, are going to be responsible for cleaning up their room. Now that might sound like a little thing, but if mom has went back to work and she's working full time, she needs all the help she can get. So she'll need her children to be able to do that, to clean up their own room and make their bed, things like this. And as they get a little older, she might depend on the children for doing more household chores around the house, especially if her and dad are working full-time jobs. Now, likewise, we can also look at single-parent households, where it's just basically, because it's usually the way it is mom and kids. You can understand that these families as systems are much more fragile because the relationship between mom and the kids is even more crucial. In other words, mom must depend upon the kids to do certain things, and it puts the system in danger if the kids don't. Whereas before, with mom, dad, and kids, mom and dad could share loads and so forth until children could start pitching in. Anyway, so there we have the family as a system. Okay? And again, the family as a system is going to have a boundary. In this case, probably the best example is last name. In other words, if you share that last name, then you are a member of the system, and if you don't, you're a member of the environment. You might be able to find a geographical boundary there too. Those people who live in the house at 21 Elm Street, that serves as a boundary. But we can find evidence of a boundary. Okay, then the environment. So the environment exists out there, and it is giving things to the system and then taking something from them. All sorts of things that the environment can give with the system, with the family system. Information would be one thing. Technically, I guess you could argue money, the pay from mom and dad, insurance, and so forth. The educational possibilities for children and so forth. All these things are out there. The media would also be one that would definitely be the environment and the input into the system. And then what does the system spit back out into the environment? Well, a number of different things. Mom and dad, they have their careers and so forth. Well, those careers exist in the environment. Socialized children would get spit out as 18-year-olds moving away and going off for the first time, and so forth. So there is, just like CSU is a system, the family is a system that depends upon the environment for certain needs, and likewise gives things back to the environment. And as I said before, the family as a system is going to have a goal, and obviously that goal, more than anything else, is for its survival. Now let's talk about the conflict perspective, which is a very dominant theory in sociology. If you remember back to intro, this is Karl Marx, who believed that there's basically two classes in democratic and capitalist systems, and those are what he called the bourgeoisie, what we're going to call the haves, and the proletariat, which we're going to call the have-nots. He basically said that the bourgeoisie, the haves, were the ones that had the property, the money, the wealth, the material goods, and were able to use those things to gain power, to have power, and to use power, to more or less keep the have-nots in place. Now, who are the have-nots? The ones that worked for the haves, the ones that, I shouldn't say past tense, according to the theory, would be the ones that do work for the haves, the ones that don't have property and wealth, not enough anyway to affect power. So he said, in this constant struggle for scarce resources, the haves basically use their power in terms of legislative ability and other means in more less democratic states to keep the have-nots in place. In other words, to keep the haves where they are, to keep the status quo. And more importantly, if the haves have this power, the ability to control others, the ability to affect law, that their view of things is what's going to end up dictating policy for the most part. So you don't get a lot of diversity in terms of opinions. For instance, when you look at legislators in the United States, the vast majority of them are male. And when you go in and you look who those males are, they're predominantly white, predominantly middle-aged, predominantly wealthy, predominantly Protestant and predominantly Anglo-Saxon. Now, with that in mind, can you see similarities in attitudes that are likely to exist among many of these legislators? It's not necessarily what you would call a conspiracy, that they've all gotten together and decided what their attitudes are going to be towards the have-nots. It's not so much that as much as they all come from similar backgrounds, so they all share very similar attitudes of what things are. So, for instance, if you were to go and ask a legislator, that typifies the character I've just described, and you ask them, well, what is family? I can guarantee you they're going to give you a relatively conservative view of what a family is. Mom, dad, kids. It's that simple to them. Well, what's the problem with that? It's not taking into account newer forms of family. The idea of single parenthood. You are far too young to remember, I'm sure, but there was a series in the 1980s called Murphy Brown. And played by Candice Bergen. Murphy Brown was a very, very famous and competent reporter, news reporter, I believe. She, in one of the episodes, got pregnant and decided to have the child without being married. And let's see, what was his name? Vice President from Indiana, of all places. Dan Quayle. Yes, Dan Quayle came out and he basically criticized the show because it seemed to glorify single parenthood. And this you would not believe the uproar that it's caused. But there are many legislators coming from this very conservative, traditional background, but who have the power to basically say what family should be. And in their view, family was not, single female-headed households. It was not an unwed mother. Certainly is not going to be, gay and lesbian family. So, you look at who defines the family, and you understand, where Marx's conflict perspective is very relevant to the study of family, because very few people, try to shape other people's view of what the family is and what it isn't. And as I say, you see this every 4 years in elections. And so who suffers from this kind of very narrow-minded approach to what family is and so forth? The answer is women, children, of course, minorities, and the poor. So this is very, very relevant as we study families. That many types of families, many types of people who are in these families are victims, if you want to put it that way, of this kind of power being used to shape identity. And then we can look at the feminist theory, which is basically, it came out of the conflict perspective. And what's interesting about this, just to kind of even further illustrate what I was just talking about, why is it that feminist in our culture has a very, very negative connotation? Feminist is, for the most part, maybe I'm making a joke of it here, but I don't think so. The idea is just that people think of feminists as being radical. They burn their bras. They're all lesbians. They're in a man's world when they should be at home, cooking and cleaning or whatever the case may be. But feminist, it really has a horrible connotation, among the majority of Americans. Now, the question is, why is that? Because when you look at the definition of a feminist, and it's basically anybody who believes that men and women are equal, and that equality should be reflected in the law and in education and other things. And I don't know of many people. In fact, I'm not really sure I know of anybody who, to my face, would say that men and women shouldn't be equal. So, by default, I guess that every person that I know, and probably 99% of the students that are in my classes, would have to be regarded as feminists. Yet, if I were to walk in and call my students feminists, they would be very angry. I'm sure, the majority of them, especially the males. So why is it that we have that kind of very negative connotation about feminism? And this is where you can argue, support for the conflict perspective. That there are these groups of people, primarily men, with these wealthy Protestant backgrounds and so forth, who shape America, who set its agenda. who make its laws, and they basically offer visions of America, explanations of America, laws and so forth, geared upon how they see things, which is from a very, very conservative viewpoint. All right, this is the last theory we're going to be talking about, symbolic interaction. It is the simplest of all the theories, and at the same time, the most complex. So let's start talking about it. First, it's a micro-level theory. What's that mean? It means we're looking at face-to-face interactions. And the most important component of the symbolic interaction is the interpretation of symbols. Our world is nothing but symbols when you get right down to it. And symbols take on a meaning that should be shared, but not often is. For instance, within a relationship, there are a number of reasons that husbands and wives divorce. And, infidelity, of course, is important. So is financial problems. But one of the very common, maybe even at the core of many of these problems, is a failure to communicate. As Scudder Martin said in Cool Hand Luke, what we have here is a failure to communicate. Now, I realize all of you 18, 19-year-olds are not going to get that at all, but it comes from a movie called Cool Hand Luke. Well, here's my point. When you look at husbands and wives and their relationships, and you go and you study why couples divorce, and clearly one of the things that you find is something that has to do with what are called contracts. And what this implies is that boyfriends, girlfriends, engaged couples bring to the marriage with them expectations called a contract. In other words, they have an idea of what the other person will do, what behaviors they'll exhibit, what they'll say, these kinds of things. In other words, they have expectations of what they expect from a spouse. Both of them have these expectations. But in our culture, it's very common for couples not to verbalize these unwritten contracts. In other words, they don't bring them up. And one of the reasons they don't want to bring them up is because they don't want to cause problems, maybe, in the relationship, which is really ridiculous because they're actually almost sealing the fate of the relationship by not talking about things. This is very funny because when I ask my students, I ask them if anybody is engaged or so forth, and then I ask them, have you discussed, for instance, who's going to do the household tasks around the house? And it's very common to find that couples who are engaged haven't discussed it, and they seem to be uncomfortable about discussing it. Another thing would be prenuptial agreements. Prenuptial agreements can be a lot of things, but for the most part, the public thinks of them as about money and property and these kinds of things. And it's true, for the most part, most people probably don't need prenuptial agreements. For instance, the state of Georgia being a community property state, what that means is, for instance, if a man let's say a man has a business, or he's inherited property, or whatever the case may be. He's got something that he possesses prior to the marriage, and he gets married. Anything that he earns, they earn, during the marriage is community property. In other words, 50-50. However, the state of Georgia and most states recognize that any property he owned prior to the marriage is still his and cannot fall under the community property law. Nevertheless, older people, middle-aged people are far more likely to get prenuptial agreements than younger-aged people. But they can be a number of different things. They can even be about how children are going to be raised, what religion they're going to be raised in, a whole gamut of things, not just about money. Nevertheless, in some research that I did a few years ago, what I found was that there was an inverse relationship between positive attitudes towards prenuptial agreements and imminence of marriage. Don't let that scare you. What it really means is this: the more distant somebody imagined themselves getting married, the more positive they felt towards prenuptial agreements. In other words, having a prenuptial was a good thing. But the closer they were to getting married, the less positive were their attitudes towards prenuptial agreements. Now, if you think this through, what's that imply? Well, somebody, for instance, who would say, well, I don't expect to get married for 4, 5, 6 years, okay, probably, has nobody in mind. In other words, they're not engaged, so they're thinking about marriage abstractly. That way, then they can think about prenuptial agreements objectively. On the other hand, if somebody is close to getting married, right, in other words, 6 months, a year, almost certainly means there is somebody in their life. They're either engaged or they're going to be engaged. And now when they think about prenuptial agreements, what it causes for them is a conflict, because they see prenuptial agreements as in direct contradiction to love. In other words, for us, many of us, many people, love equals trust. And it's a very reckless, dangerous attitude to have, but very common, especially younger people, as they get closer to marriage. They see love and trust as being the same thing, and so prenuptial agreements are not something that they would ever want to bring up with the person that they're going to marry. So, coming back to this idea of marriage contracts, unspoken, is that they've got these, so they get married and they've got these expectations of what each other should be doing. And they don't say anything because communication levels are generally low in most couples these days, so they don't talk about it. Well, what's the problem with that? Then people start building up resentment. They begin to find fault with the other person, and they begin to accumulate fault. That's the more important thing. And so they don't talk about these things until they either blow up or it goes so far that one person says, that's it, I want a divorce. So here's what I'm trying to get at, is that they both look at marriage as these maybe even like a soap opera or a romantic movie or something like this. They have their images of what marriage will be, which includes all the things that spouse will be and will do and will say. But reality is probably going to be different. And so because they never talked about these expectations, people begin to get their feelings hurt because somebody doesn't do something that they think they should do. If you've ever heard couples, you'll almost always hear a couple who have problems with communication. You'll hear one say to the other one, I'm not a mind reader. And that's very common, but it's a big red flag, because what it's pointing out is one or both members of a couple who aren't able to express themselves. And so they're constantly either hurting the other person's feelings or they're getting hurt, whatever, because they think somebody should be doing something, and they're not, and so forth. So it really creates a very, very bad situation and can lead to divorce. Okay, the life course perspective. Well, first of all, it's a micro-level theory. Secondly, it was developed specifically to study the family. And what it has to do with are developmental stages. And with each of these stages, there are tasks to be learned. And many of these stages, you have to master the stage before you can move to the next stage, and so forth. But for instance, if we were to look at children and look at the developmental stages and tasks that they have to go through, and you understand that being able to socialize with other children their age is an important developmental task. But is part of the overall developmental stage of childhood. Reaction to teasing and bullying, which is always there, for school children and so forth. How that is dealt with by the family, certainly by the child as well. Those are tasks to be mastered, so that's part of the developmental stage. When you get older, for instance, and you look at some of the developmental stage for typically for people who are married, especially in the 20s and 30s. And you find, for instance, typically stress over developing careers, stress, of course, about money, maybe stress about starting families. And then, in middle-aged years, what you find is there may be stress with thinking about retirement. Are they prepared? Are they saving enough? One of the things that the current recession did is it hugely cut into people's retirement savings, those investments and so forth that they had. And they would probably not be able to recover them by the time that they retire, which means for many middle-aged people, what they had to face is the prospect of not living as comfortably after retirement as they had been hoping for and working toward. And then you can look at, for instance, the elderly, as far as some of the stressors there. Sickness, of course, is there. Disability is there. For women, it would be a fear of divorce, well, actually, not so much in later life, but rather in the middle-aged years and so forth. Elderly worry about getting sick and being put in a nursing home, or how are they going to pay for their medications. So Life Course Perspective says that for every developmental stage, there are normal behaviors, normal occurrences, there are problems, there are tasks to solve and so forth. And these are all influenced by so many different things, by other family members, by friends, the economy, the culture, and so forth. So it's a very interesting way of studying how people deal with problems and tasks as they follow along this life course. So, for instance, we could look at here what's called the classic portrayal of the family life cycle. For instance, stage 1, couple without children. Stage 2, oldest child younger than 30 months old. They move to stage 3, where the child is now a little older. Stage 4, where the child is between 6 and 13. Stage 5, the child is between 13 and 20. Stage 6 is basically when the child leaves the family. This leads to stage 7, the empty nest, to retirement. And then 8, retirement to death of one of both spouses. If you were to stop and think of each one of these stages, think of the myriad problems and tasks that have to be dealt with at each one of these stages. For instance, the easiest one here to talk about is the empty nest stage. When you look at the divorce rate goes up when children leave the nest, so to speak. Why? Well, I know maybe you don't quite understand this, but many couples, when a child comes along, spend so much of their time and energy on raising the child that they become less attuned to their spouse. All their efforts and energies are concentrated on the child, and they forget about the spouse to some degree. And so what happens is when the child leaves the nest, you've got a husband and wife who don't know each other. Now, of course, many husbands and wives, the empty nest is a time to rejoice. Some husbands and wives, when their child leaves the nest at 18 or whatever it is, that's when they break open the champagne and they go to Tahiti for a month or whatever the case may be. It's really a cause for celebration. I wish I could think of the movie. You're going to have to help me here. The movie with I can't remember his name, Matthew McConaughey, where he stays too long, and his parents want him out of the house. But I remember one of the things about that movie is that there is one scene where I believe it's his mother is talking about how she just doesn't know her husband, and she's actually scared of being alone with him, and so forth. This is a very, very common fear among couples. And some couples manage to sail right through it, and they work out this developmental task, but other couples aren't. And so you find this is not an uncommon point for couples to divorce. So every single one of these stages you're seeing has this multitude of tasks that need to be worked out. And so this is one of the reasons that the Life Course Perspective is so very important in studying the family.